All right, well, good afternoon, folks. Welcome to the Conservation Banking webinar series. We're going to get started here with webinar 6, Long-Term Management and Stewardship Roles and Requirements After Bank Closure. My name is Katie Allen, and I work with the Conservation Fund, and I'll be facilitating this webinar today. We're looking forward to getting started. Great to have many of you join us again, and hello to the new folks joining for this series. Before we get started, just want to take a moment with some quick orientation for folks that are new to WebEx, or I don't know if that's possible during this age of virtual meetings, but welcome to this platform. As a reminder, all participants will remain muted for the duration of the presentations. I do ask that everybody use the chat box to ask questions, and you can select everyone or the host so that I can see those questions and ask our presenters those questions as time allowed. You are able to select your preferred video view during the discussion. I recommend choosing grid view. This is found on your screen in the right-hand corner of your viewing screen. And a closed captioning link is now in the chat, and that will provide live captioning of the audio. By clicking on that link, you can follow along in a separate browser. So just to orient yourself to the screen, your video view menu is up into the right-hand corner. Your chat box is going to be found by clicking on the chat icon. You will also be able to see all participants by clicking on the participant list. And if needed, you can provide any feedback using the feedback icon. Yes, no are options that you can provide answers to any questions that our panelists or myself might ask you. So welcome again. We're going to get started here. For those of you that don't know the Conservation Fund, we are a national nonprofit that works across the country to conserve land. And we do that by finding projects and programs that make environmental sense and economic sense. And we are top ranked for efficiency and effectiveness in doing so. We have experience in mitigation. We lead the technical training for the National Conservation Banking training held at the National Conservation Training Center, as well as the Wetland and Stream Mitigation Bank course for interagency review teams. Our mitigation solutions team is on the ground across the country working to support the mitigation providers and regulatory entities in selecting great projects to implement across the country to meet any development needs. As mentioned, this is the Conservation Banking webinar series. It is an 8-part series based on that National Conservation Banking training course. Presenters have been from across the fields, from federal regulatory agencies, non-governmental organizations, and the private banking community. And although all of you that are may be interested or have colleagues that are interested, all of these webinars are recorded and they are posted to our webinar website. So after today's webinar, you will see that webinar posted to the webinar site that will be provided a link in our chat box for easy reference, as well as all other of the 5 already previously recorded webinars can be found there as well. Also posted are speaker bios, contact information, the presentations themselves, and any resources and references that can also help further your instruction on any of the topics presented on. So a great resource, and we hope that you can check that out. This could not have been possible free of cost to all of you. Thank you to our sponsors and partners who have been involved in the process. Specifically want to thank the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the Department of Agriculture, the Federal Highway Administration, and our supporting partnerships from the Bureau of Land Management, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, the NOAA Marine Fisheries Service, and members of the Ecological Restoration Business Association. We have 2 more webinars left. We're very excited about that. We're kind of wrapping up today our discussion on conservation banking, and we were going to pivot towards some alternatives in conservation banking and looking at some cutting edge themes that are occurring across the country. And some of these are banks, some of these are different types of programs. Our first part is going to be on emerging applications of multiple authority mitigation. And so we're going to be looking at some really interesting joint authority projects that are happening in the Pacific Northwest, working in support in tandem with state agencies, with different agencies, with the federal land agencies, and taking a look at how the structures of these types of compensatory mitigation programs are coming together for habitat and species conservation. Additionally, our second part on webinar, it's going to be webinar 8, has a new date of Thursday, February 4th, on programmatic approaches to mitigation. And this one, we're going to be talking about a much deeper look into in lieu fee programs and how they're different than banks, and also some case studies from the Department of Defense on some of the programmatic approaches that they'll be taking. So we hope that you can save the date for both of these, and that'll round out and conclude our conservation banking webinar series. So without further ado, I want to turn things over to our panelists today. So this session on long-term management and stewardship is going to discuss the roles and responsibilities of bank sponsors and long-term stewards in developing and implementing management plans and the stewardship funding mechanisms needed to ensure continued mitigation compliance. So today we have Matt Goss. He is the Ecological Resources and Land Stewardship Director at the Westervelt Ecological Services, and he oversees the stewardship process on over 18,000 acres of property that Westervelt holds across the California, the Rocky Mountain, Rocky Mountains section of the U.S. as well as the southeast of the U.S. And in his role, he's got a diversity of elements that he takes over, but he also as well as what we're going to ask him to talk about today, is how do private bankers like Westervelt and others really look at how land management plans can be developed now for the expected future closure of banks, and what does that need to look like to continue to retain the functions of that bank, to further the ecological functions that that bank was set up to do. In addition to that, we really want to ask, how do you cost that? How do you get to that cost estimate? And Matt's going to walk through the process of how that comes together. Additionally, we're joined by Clint Miller. He serves as the Central Midwest Regional Director for the Conservation Fund, and his roles are also diverse and related to land conservation, wildlife management, and planning and implementation of mitigation projects. He is also a commissioner for the Land Trust Accreditation Commission, and he's going to be talking to us about the land trust role in mitigation, especially as a conservation easement, things to look out for, how to start the conversation with land trusts and understand how they function in general, as well as how it applies in the field of mitigation. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to Matt to kick things off today. And feel free to ask any questions in the chat as we go through the presentation, and I'll ask Matt to answer any questions when he's finished with his presentation.
Thank you, Katie. I appreciate the introduction, and greetings, everybody. You know, as Katie alluded, normally this is part of an in-person class, which is a great thing. If we actually get back to in-person meetings, it's a great thing to participate in, because there's a lot of continuity between the sessions, and the session I present on long-term stewardships towards the end, and it helps kind of bring together a lot of the prior concepts on site selection and performance standards and such. So let me go ahead and try sharing here. And are we good there?
Yep.
Okay, excellent. Well, I'm going to go through quite a few slides here. Some of them are going to go rather rapidly. Typically, I'm used to having a little bit of back and forth with the classroom on this, which we're not going to have here. But please be sure and ask questions at the end, or put them in the chat box so we can try to address them. Just a little bit of background. This background picture here is the valley floor of the Central Valley of California outside of Bakersfield in its natural state. It's a unique, beautiful place when it rains. So just to let everyone remember that California just isn't a bunch of cities and ag land. So what is conservation? And really, conservation is a very long-term commitment. And really, one of the reasons I used to be an environmental consultant and wrote epitaphs for Habitat, like many of us have for many years. And also, we often facilitated piecemeal mitigation projects, which weren't very sustainable or resilient in the face of stressors. And I think one of the things that really intrigued me about banking was the idea that we could make a more substantial contribution to the conservation picture. And really, banking also provides, through some of the requirements for long-term stewardship, especially conservation banking and wetland mitigation banking, it provides for a much more durable product at the end of the day, where something that we can actually have money to manage into the future. And really, what does long-term stewardship look like? It looks a lot like this guy here. And I put up this gentleman's picture. His name is Steve Summers. We purchased, Westervelt that is, purchased a duck club in Sassoon Marsh in California with the aims of restoring it to tidal marsh. And we have since completed that project. But Steve came with the property when we purchased it. He was the caretaker. He had been living there for 30 plus years, had not spent a day off of the property, an overnight day off the property in 27 years. But he was an incredible resource of information. And in a lot of ways, I find that he really embodied the concept and the ethic of stewardship over time. And I always like to pay respects to Steve. He still works with us. He's a great advisor, and he's really good at helping us understand that we have very little control over Mother Nature, which is something we all need to remember. Really, we have to all remember that acquisition is really not protection. And Sherry Teresa said this back in 2008 and she was the founder of the Central for National Lands Management. She said this at a transportation conference to try to drive home the idea that even though we're acquiring properties for conservation, they're really not protected just because they're acquired. We really need to have a fund in there to help manage it. This is a picture of, this is classic urban encroachment. This is a dog from a neighboring land owner harassing a gopher tortoise on one of our property, Westervelt's property in Mississippi. This is the kind of thing which you need ongoing funding to help educate our neighbors or repair fences and such forth. And you have things that happen periodically too on our preserves. This is a gate on one of our preserves in Solano County, California, which we got notice from our neighbor that somebody who was drunk drove through it. Well, without an endowment fund and a management plan, we really would not have had a means by which to fix that. Fortunately, with those things in place, there is a means, a process, and a bucket of money, so to speak, to manage it. Furthermore, as we all know, all of our landscapes in many parts of the country are under constant pressure and stress from invasive species, as well as humans. And as you can see with the feral pigs, we can have this problem, almost anywhere in the U.S. And that sort of control or, controlling the damage from these species will require somebody's time and probably funds. So really, we need to plan ahead for long-term stewardship. So back to conservation banks, and really, I think the concept with conservation banks really needs to be extended to all permitting responsible mitigation as well. In that, as you learned in earlier webinars, there's this real estate protection mechanism, the conservation easement, which is really key, assuming it's legal in the state you're operating within. Really key to ensuring some sort of long-term protection, legal protection for that parcel. And then with a bank also, we have this management plan, which exists in many different forms I've discovered across the nation, but it's basically the guiding document for the land manager or land steward to manage the resources that that we're trying to conserve, and also manage them within a framework that's adaptive and allows for alterations in management approach over time, given additional stressors or changes in climate or changing adjacent land uses. And then along with that, the third leg of the school is the stewardship funding, which I'm going to touch a little bit on later, on how we arrive at how to estimate the stewardship costs, and also how to properly invest those funds so that you have a durable, long-lasting, potentially, hopefully perpetual stewardship fund available for that property that flows with the property and is utilized by a land manager. I'm going to touch really quickly kind of on the regulatory framework for why would there need to be a management plan and a stewardship fund. And I'm not super up to date on this, but my recollection is that back in 2016, right before the current administration, or right prior to the current administration taking over in Washington, D.C., we had a mitigation sort of rule very similar to the wetland mitigation rule that was for Endangered Species Act compensatory mitigation. Well, when the administration took over, that compensatory rule for ESA impacts was basically rolled back and defaulted back to these early 1980 guidelines, which loosely refer to, a project being able to ensure that its beneficial or compensatory actions are funded even after the project ceases to exist. So there's fairly loose, a loose tie there. And just, that picture of a snake, that's a giant garter snake from the Central Valley of California. It's a threatened species of which Westervelt and several other mitigation providers in California have conservation sites that are actively managed for those species. Within the mitigation rule for wetlands, it's very clear in the federal regs that it calls for a long-term management plan, adaptive management plan and provisions. It identifies the responsible party and it addresses the funding directed towards long-term management. That's very straight, very direct. And I've also seen that takes different shapes and forms across the country. I've been involved in mitigation banking and conservation in California for a little bit over 20 years. And I've seen quite an evolution in California. And there's an evolution happening elsewhere in the country also. But I would say that the complexity and detail in California is very, very thorough and probably similar to some of the complexity on the Eastern Seaboard. So as I go through this talk, a lot of ways it references what's been happening in California because think of it as the most thorough case. So let's talk a little bit about the management plan. One thing that's really important to really think about on any mitigation bank or conservation bank is, okay, we can set this up, but how do we actively manage it? How do we protect it? How do we, perpetuate the values on the site? We can't just walk away. I think many of us that have worked in the conservation field have seen the after effects of walking away from a conservation site. Most of the time, it does not turn out well. It either gets invaded, overrun by invasives, and I've even seen instances where they've been converted to other land uses because people just haven't been watching. And I will continue to reiterate throughout my talk that I think it is very important, both as a practitioner of banking and also for our regulatory partners, to consider long-term management and stewardship funds best practice for conservation projects. Now, in one of the earlier webinars that we talked about site selection. Site selection of your conservation project or your bank site or your permanently responsible mitigation site really comes to roost when it comes to determining your ongoing management costs and how complicated it is going to be through time. As you can see in this illustration, here's a site that's undergoing some prescribed fire right next to a major interstate. This site is going to be comparatively much more complicated and expensive to conduct a prescribed fire on, given the sensitive receptor of this interstate highway next door, than a similar site would be, say, off in a rural area where it's surrounded by other conservation sites with similar management practices. So site selection is a very big driver in how we address long-term stewardship. On the flip side, here is a Californian vernal pool landscape. Those are vernal pools, the aquatic features in the background, shallow seasonal aquatic wetlands. The primary management tool for vernal pool grasslands and vernal pool landscapes is cattle grazing. And that's to manage the non-native annual grasses and fords which dominate this landscape now. This Conservation Bank exists in a matrix of many other very large conservation properties. So you have thousands upon thousands of acres of grazing land. We have no trouble finding grazers who want to graze this. It fits into the landscape well, and the cost of managing it is comparatively low. On the flip side, again, here we have a little small mitigation site nestled within a very intensive residential development. This is in Folsom, California, and I was involved in one of these projects next door to this, many years ago. And that mitigation site is essentially a recreational park now. It is overrun by invasives. It's poorly managed. It's managed by a homeowners association, which has no concrete funding source other than that they use a portion of the homeowners' dues to try to manage it. And as I've watched this site over the last 20 years, it's become more and more degraded. It suffers from a lack of management. So let's talk real quickly about some basic land management plan topics. Of course, it has some baseline site data, some information on management personnel, and I think this is important because the management personnel helps identify who's the sort of person or outfit that would have the proper qualifications to manage those resources. Prohibited actions, I find, in activities are probably pretty important to include in the management plan. They're often included in the conservation easement, but to be honest, a lot of land managers will never see the conservation easement, nor will they look at it frequently. It also should go into the management activities. I like to include stuff on facility maintenance, of course, the monitoring and reporting, how you interact with the responsible regulatory agencies, how adaptive management is implemented and approved, and also a section on funding and task prioritization, which I'll go into a little bit later on the importance of that. Allowed and prohibited uses, okay? And I'm going to say this again because this is something that often gets lost in the fray. Just for instance, I just the other day received notification that one of our properties that our easement holder felt that we had bee boxes on the property, and they felt that that was an agricultural use and thus, not compatible with the conservation easement conditions, which in fact, taken by the letter of the easement conditions, it probably isn't. However, if we look through the management plan, it is a specific allowed use within the management plan. And if you look at the conservation easement refers back to the management plan for clarification on allowed uses. So I guess my message here is to understand there's an interplay between the easement and the management plan and the way they reference one another. So it's imperative that bank sponsors, as well as the IRT and reviewers, understand the interaction between management plans and conservation easements in the context of allowed and prohibited uses, because all of those elements are very important to how successfully we can manage the sites. And just so everyone knows, a lot of times we use bee boxes in the Central Valley of California to deter trespass at certain entrance locations to our bank. That's why we put them there. And so we had to help our CE holder understand why we were using them and why they were out there. So really at the root of any management plan are the resource goals and objectives, because that's really what we're managing for. And I'm using, this is a very generic example, but these are real examples from early vernal pool conservation banks in the Sacramento Valley. And as you can see here, the resource goal and objective for this conservation bank was simply to support the flora and fauna that the bank was established to protect, the conservation values and perpetuity. If you read into detail into that document, you'll find the conservation values are really related to federally listed invertebrate species or crustaceans which inhabit these vernal pools, which are vernal pool fairy shrimp and vernal pool tadpole shrimp, which are seasonally occurring invertebrates that inhabit these temporarily inundated waters. So keying off the resource goals and objectives, we come up with more detailed goals and objectives. And this is a goal and objective set, like I said, from an older bank related to vernal pool fairy shrimp. And the goal is to maintain suitable habitat conditions for vernal pool crustaceans. And the objective that underlies that is to make sure you maintain the characteristic hydrology of the site. And that means for that individual pool, maintaining the water that flows into it, the water that flows out of it, and basically how the water ponds within that habitat site, that habitat unit, so that we can make sure we have habitat for the shrimp, fairy shrimp. So the management activities for vernal pool landscapes, often the primary management activity revolves around grazing, as I mentioned earlier. And we use grazing as a tool to manage the thatch in the uplands around the pool, because that thatchy leftover grass has been shown through various studies to absorb runoff and precipitation, and actually sort of decreases the inundation period potentially of these vernal pools. So we use cattle to break down that thatch. We could use fire also as part of it, but fire in California, as we all know, is a very sensitive topic, so it's not used very often. Furthermore, cattle also sort of roughly emulate the previous, widespread grazing by native ungulates in California, pronghorn antelope, and elk and other animals that used to inhabit the state but are now gone. Also, another benefit of cattle is they do get in the wetlands and they kind of disturb them and muck them up. And in all reality, for several of our invertebrate species and vertebrate species, such as California tiger salamander, it can actually add to the microhabitat value for those species. So cattle grazing is a relatively simple, management action. We coordinate with some grazers, we set up a lease, we work closely with the grazers, and it's not too bad in terms of a burden on land stewardship. And so, yeah, there's relatively simple actions like the Meridian Ranch, like you just saw a picture of, where you're grazing it as a management tool. Very complicated and very time-consuming management is, here's an aerial photograph of a managed giant garter snake habitat in the Central Valley of California. This is a habitat type where we actively pump water out of the agricultural water delivery system, add it to these habitat cells, and manage the water levels actively for the various life stages of the snake, as well as manage upland habitats so the snakes have areas to have refuge and to estrivate and reproduce. So when one's looking at the management activities for these banks, they can be very simple and fairly affordable or cheap, or they can be very expensive, like having to pump water out of an agricultural ditch or a deep groundwater well over and over again, year after year. So the complexity and the expense of these management activities is going to have a lot of bearing on your costs. So once again, kind of going back to management activities for these vernal pool grasslands, fairly straightforward. You got grazing as their primary one I want to use. As an alternative, if there's no cattle, I guess you could mow it, very costly and kind of unrealistic, or you can burn it, which is another option. It's not too expensive unless you light somebody else's land on fire. But in the management plan, we're trying to describe all of the various tools that we know of so that they're accommodated either in the costing or in the analysis of how we're going to manage these sites going forward. And I also want to touch a little bit on maintenance. And I try to make a little bit of a distinction between management activities where you're managing for the resource and the resource goals, and maintaining structures and elements that help everything function. The photo on the left is basically, that's in relation to, you see there's a lot of grazing on one side and no grazing on the other side of that fence. That's because on the side of the fence that doesn't have much grazing, the water supply had broken, and therefore the cattle were not wanting to use that pasture. They were concentrating the pasture with water. So in the management plan, we need to cost and accommodate the repair of those facilities over time. even though they're not directly related to the management of the species. So we need to make sure we cover maintenance items also. And let's all realize too that land stewardship doesn't exist in a vacuum. These preserves don't exist in a vacuum. Here are some gentlemen walking onto one of our properties in the middle of the night. We use lots of game cameras, and we send the photos to our cell phones and email so we can keep track of stuff. Unusual occurrence, but here they are walking out with some of our equipment. This is an unexpected expense, and it's important when you're also costing out your endowments to have some contingency funds or some acknowledgement that there's going to be things that happen which you don't expect, and you're going to have theft, you're going to have trespass, you're going to have problems you're going to have to accommodate into the future. So another component of our management plans, of course, is our monitoring and reporting. Really, what do we need to know to inform management? And I want to stress that I think it's important in the management plans to identify the general idea that you're going to be, what you're going to do for monitoring. This photo here is of a nested plot sampling protocol, which was for a bank we had in the southeast of the US. It's extremely complicated and very time consuming and not very informative. I think there's a lot of ways where there could have been a more efficient method. So I think it's important when we're all looking at the monitoring programs for these projects moving forward that we find something that's cost effective and informative and doable over the long term. Not to say that we won't adjust monitoring programs or protocols as technology advances. This is a simple example of a simple qualitative monitoring task. And the reason I like to include these qualitative tasks in a lot of these conservation projects is because it forces people to get their boots on the ground. If there is one thing I've discovered that is more important than all else is having someone lay eyes on a project on a fairly regular basis, at least on a seasonal level, so that we can see what's going on. And if all possible, bump into our neighbors and talk to them and see what's happening with the landscape. And I'm kind of going to start accelerating here because I see I'm sort of digging into the time. I think it's also very important that we have quantitative monitoring that's required to help, especially when we have conserved species that we're trying to quantify what the population is like. And there's a lot of different ways to do this, and there's different ways and different time frames that you can do it over. And you need to establish thresholds for action if you can. There are times where I think we all need to recognize that on the site level, we may not have very many levers to pull or very many knobs to turn when it comes to certain species we're trying to conserve. But on a system-wide level, that's where the knobs and levers exist. And the management plan needs to acknowledge how and when the land manager needs to reach out to the resource agencies or other NGOs or species experts to start looking at why these trends that they're observing are starting to change. Another thing to remember too is that things break. If you have like instrumented long-term monitoring requirements, which many of us do, especially with wetland resources, that equipment breaks over time and it has to be replaced. The other thing I've discovered after the last decade of some of our instrumentation is that some of it doesn't get supported any longer. People close up shop, so you need to be able to adapt and change. So it's important to accommodate equipment costs while doing your endowment calculations, that you may need to replace things through time. Agency notification. I want to bring this up again because there does need to be a fairly explicit process by which the land manager, land steward notifies the agency and what he or she notifies them about, and also how to get resolution or input from the agencies. That's a pretty important clause, and it also ensures that everyone's on the same page as to, what their roles and responsibilities are going forward. This little next element is on adaptive management, and I'm not going to drill down as much on this as I normally do during the in-person class, but I think my take-home message on this is that it is adaptive management is a topic which is treated differently across the country. I think in California, it has taken on a very complex adaptation. Elsewhere in the country, this simple phrase is oftentimes what I hear is management through trial, error, learning, and adjustment. And it kind of follows this this sort of pathway or process where you're assessing the problem, you're designing a potential solution, you're implementing that, you're monitoring it, you're looking at the results, you're evaluating and adjusting. That's the simple adaptive management wheel. I think that every single project has a slightly different approach to adaptive management, but from a land management and land steward perspective, speaking from being a land steward, adaptive management is, in my viewpoint, is something that it's really, this is another example, it's really it's in its base idea is there to give land managers the ability to have flexibility to keep things in an optimal state. So it's allowing the resource to move kind of in between two bookends. And those are acceptable outcomes within those bookends. And when it starts to get outside of those bookends, or if it's bumping up against one of those bookends repeatedly, then we start to dig into this adaptive management process itself. The reason I say this is because I've had situations on mitigation sites where adaptive management has become the primary point of discussion moving forward and getting approval. And I think it's something we all need to consider. It's really important, but it's not the end all be all, because I say 15 years down the road, when we have something we have to adaptively manage, we're all going to have to get together anyway and talk about how we accomplish it. This is an example of an adaptive management wheel from Australia. It's a little interesting in that if you think it's Australia, so you think it turned the other way, but never mind, it turns to the clockwise anyway. But what it does is it sort of bypasses, when you evaluate and learn, you adjust and do instead of going back to planning, which if you look at a lot of the conceptual models for adaptive management, they always continue through planning. So it's just a slightly different view on the process. Neighbor relations, I just want to touch on this real quick. This is also important for people to consider when evaluating management plans. We all spend, those of us who manage land, a lot of time talking to neighbors. They are both our best friends when it comes to land stewardship, and they can also be our worst enemies. So that needs to be accommodated and addressed in a management plan if possible. Now, I'm going to transition quickly into determining management costs and some different methods for it. This is an example cover sheet from the property analysis record software developed by the Center for National Lands Management. It's a very sophisticated piece of software. It's very effective. It's very clean to use. It is not free. You do have to pay for it, but it's very thorough and it sort of pre-bakes all the costing categories for you. So if you're not familiar with trying to cost out land stewardship, it's a good place to start. And it's designed to accommodate a conservation project all the way from conservation all the way through long-term stewardship. And it's basically an online database. I think they have an app for your phone, got drop-down menus, very clean, very easy to use. Very good if you're not in the habit of doing stewardship endowments all the time. Similarly, the Nature Conservancy has a stewardship calculator, which is quite similar, but not sort of in depth as the PAR. It has a companion workbook and spreadsheet that can help you think through a lot of things. But One of the things that both the PAR and the stewardship calculator don't have is hard costs. That's up to the bank sponsor and the resource agencies to try to hash out or agree to what those hard costs are like. Like, how much does a linear foot of fence cost? How much does it cost to do surveys for giant garter snakes? And that is something that you have to work out within the IRT, or CBRT, as we say. What I'm going to do is I'm going to walk you through how we do it using the manual method. And this is how we do it at Westervelt and how it's done by some other bankers I know. And the manual method, what we're doing is we're taking that management plan, taking the individual goals and objectives, drilling down to the management tasks, and developing a scope out of those management tasks. So this costing spreadsheet will directly mirror the tasks in the management plan for ease of review. So let's look at something simple like replacing decrepit fence or fixing fence. Here's the fencing objective out of a conservation bank in Merced County. Monitor and maintain fencing, if necessary, facilitate the grazing regime change, and so on and so forth. Well, within that objective, the following tasks are included. You report condition of the fence each visit. You replace gates at a certain interval, and you replace fencing at a certain interval, and you do repairs associated, and this endowment budgets for 264 linear feet of fence each year. Will we replace 264 feet every year? Probably not, but the endowment does allow for it if we should need to do that. Here's an example of the costing for that. As you can see, it has the hourly rate, the hourly needs for, a tech, a senior tech, and a biologist, and a field crew to replace that fence, and the fixed cost of fence posts and barbed wire. How often we figured it cost a total of $760 a year years ago. It happens every year on a 1-year occurrence cycle, and the actual cost would be $760 a year. Along with that, we have a companion assumptions write-up, which describes all of our assumptions that went in, we used to develop that cost. So as bank sponsors, we have an open book showing the bank review team, this is how we came up with the cost. This is what we're thinking, okay? And we do that for every single management, monitoring, and maintenance task in the management plan. So everyone else is on the same page, understanding what we think just roughly we would need to do to manage this site. So really, what are we doing? We are building this war chest for conservation, as we like to say. And that, as we add up all those items, it helps create this endowment, which is a term which you're not going to hear used very much anymore, because that's sort of an old term. The principle of an endowment has always been that you never touch the principal. That's kind of old thinking and old investment theory. Newer, more recent investment theory suggests that you can tap into the principal periodically without, affecting the long-term viability of the fund. And that's really a topic for experts on investment theory to talk about, and not me. But the term we like to use nowadays is long-term stewardship fund. And I'm going to go briefly into some of the mechanics of this. I got permission to use some slides from the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. Many thanks to Stephanie Tom Coop and Tom DeCincio letting me use these, because typically they explain this in much greater detail and probably way better than I can. But there's some things I'm going to touch on, is the capitalization and spend rate, the inflation component, and funding prioritization. And here's a photo of one of our properties where we're doing a prescribed burn. As you can imagine, prescribed burns are pretty costly, and we have to have those, we very carefully cost those out in our endowments. So on to the financial stuff. So sizing the initial amount of the stewardship fund. After we've done that, it's like the spreadsheet, or you've done a PAR, or you've done some other method, it basically comes up with an annual cash stream that you need to have to manage the property, okay? And so that fee is that cost annually is used to size the principal, or the basis of the endowment. And so you have to have enough money in the endowment not only to pay for that annual stewardship cost, but you also need to have enough money to accommodate inflation. And also, and people invest this stuff also require some money on the backside to take care of your fund. So there's like an investment fee also we have to pay. So under sort of this scenario, now assuming the administrative fees at 1%, which is believe is what NIFWIF charges, and you have an inflation rate of roughly 3% annually, you have to have a fund that returns at least 4% to have anything left over. Well, in reality, you've got to be way above 4% to make a stewardship fund work. You know, so here's the other component of this. So what is the capitalization rate? You know, the cap rate, which is how much net gain you have to have in that stewardship fund in order to meet the average, you know, requirement for every year and accommodate, you know, inflation and fees. Like it says, net is in this sense is not only of fees, the investment manager and other administrative, but also net of inflation. So assuming administration fees are percent and inflation is at 3, the fund projected return on average 4% annually, there's nothing left. So what do we really need? Well, let's look at it this way. If we need $20,000 a year and the cap rate is 5%, you need to invest $400,000 into the endowment fund. However, if your cap rate is only 0.5%, which would represent a very, very low risk investment, you need $4 million invested in the endowment to provide $20,000 in returns. In practice, in my experience, the cap rate usually exists around 3.5%. That's net of inflation. Some years the funds do far better than that, and some years they do less than that. But it's a good average, at least in the 20 years that I've been working with endowment fees, endowment funds, stewardship funds. It's been roughly around 3.5% average. So recognize that the cap rate that is selected by the bank review team and the bank sponsor has a great deal of bearing on the initial fund amount. And when you start getting into the multi-million-dollar endowments for a $20,000 annual cash need, I can tell you from practice that it's very unlikely that a bank is going to be financially viable for a lot of bank sponsors. And on a final note, I'm going to kind of come right around back into the tasking and fund prioritization. This is an example prioritization and funding statement. The reason is as you saw in the previous example, we may not be replacing that fence or that 264 linear feet of fence every year at that site in Merced County. So what happens to all that money every year that we're receiving from the endowment? You know, what else can we use it for? Or how can we prioritize that money for some other element to the site that needs help? And this tasking and funding prioritization statement helps create sort of the framework and the thought process on how you adjust where you put money. Some resource agencies want to have a lot of input on this process. Some do not want any input on this process. However, it's something that should be discussed between the bank sponsor and the bank review team on how to accommodate this, because even though your management plan is inclusive, you never know within any year how things are going to pan out. And I would say it's more often the norm to have to move money around a little bit between categories than it is to keep everything exactly where it stays. So it's an important thing to consider. It's an important element of the management plan, and it's important for the stewardship manager to understand, the bank review team to understand, as well as the stewardship fund holder. And I realize I'm just about out of time here. And this is sort of a basic checklist, like the bare minimums, I would say, for the best practices for a management plan and stewardship fund. With that, I'm going to sign off here and transition it back to Katie. And please put your questions in the discussion and share them with Katie. I'd be happy to answer them later.
Yes, awesome job, Matt. Really great job. Appreciate all of the thorough information here. As we transition over to Clint, I do have a couple questions that I want to put towards you, Matt, and definitely Clint, jump in if you have any questions here. But a couple things coming up around adaptive management, and wanted to put it to you and you definitely, since you're based in California, we just got off the chatting about how there's maybe more drought or heavier rains on different years. Is that enough? Those might be naturally occurring, or it might be getting more frequent. Does that trigger adaptive management sort of right then, or do you have built in other places of your management plan that type of conversation? And then at a certain point, when does maybe that force majeure kick in? And I think we're moving farther away from that idea that there would be a naturally occurring event that would take out a bank site itself. With adaptive management in place, we actually have a tool that would allow us to come back around to it. So kind of a two-parter if you want to talk about sort of naturally occurring elements, especially in the
let's talk about naturally. Thanks, Katie. Good question. Force majeure is kind of like a highly charged third rail of everything right now. It's a bit of a legal question to some degree, but let's talk about sort of natural variation. So yes, so in California, we naturally have episodes of drought and years of good rain. But say for instance, we have a project that is water dependent. And over the last 10 years, we've had adequate water from our suppliers and it works fine, but now there's continuing drought and our water is starting to diminish. And then you start to see regulatory action by the state putting restrictions on water use and how it's used. Those sorts of things can affect our management scenario as originally costed, and also the resource goals and how we manage the site. That is, I would say, an element where, yes, we need to sound the adaptive management horn, because we have to rethink how we manage the site now that we have only 30% of the water we originally thought we had. So now, yes, we need to do this and figure out how to solve that problem. But year-to-year variation, yeah, we know that. But if it's a long-term change, then yes, we need to pull the trigger on that. Force majeure, I'm going to have to punt on that. I don't want to get into that one because it's a very complicated issue and it's treated very differently in different parts of the country.
I appreciate that. And I think we'll come back around to some more additional conversations on climate change, especially to your Clint in the field of land trusts. And I think that's a general question to kind of just understand the field of conservation at the end of the presentation. Kind of a fun one for you, Matt. I know you guys are always thinking about best ways to do things. You mentioned about the bee houses as a deterrent, and you talked about grazing. What are there other creative strategies that you guys are employing or looking at? We had a couple questions about are you employing goats anywhere? Are you using drones? Are there things that you guys have to kind of discovered that you might want to share a couple examples of?
We use goats, we use sheep, we use cattle, we've used llamas. We've done a lot of different things. And we use drones. The one thing we discovered about drones is that a lot of times our stewardship staff spends more time watching videos, less time in the field. And sometimes it's we still say, you have to go out and set foot on it. It's not going to do just to use a drone, but for inaccessible areas, drones are super handy. We also do interesting arrangements with our neighbors. Sometimes we find neighbors who have high school age kids and try to get them interested in a project related to our site so that way they're interested in our property and they start acting as their eyes and ears. And so once again, it's a neighbors thing. We don't exist in a vacuum. We like to say all mitigation, all conservation is local. And so we try to make sure we're friends with our neighbors. So a lot of times they're our biggest asset and sometimes they're our worst nightmare, but usually the nightmare neighbors tend to move on eventually.
I appreciate that. And some thoughtful considerations there with the neighbors. I think that's really important for sure. Dual purpose, as you illustrated. And before we move on to Clint, I wanted to bring up another question. Obviously long-term management is an end. It's a long-term game. It's gonna, there's really not an end there. And I think you all are also looking to be pretty entrepreneurial, whether it's the grazing, you're generating some income there with that into the long term. Have you, or do you have examples of banks that are also being built as for carbon sequestration and selling credits, or banks sort of becoming a carbon bank in sort of that long term? Maybe it's an income generation to seed funding for that bank, particularly in the long run, or just as an entity. Have you seen that, or are you guys investigating carbon sequestration as a banking mechanism?
That's another good question. And you know, being bankers and being entrepreneurial, of course, we've looked into a lot of that. But I think one thing that's really important to understand is that look at the resource you're conserving. If you're conserving like a bottomland hardwood forest, one of its primary functions is carbon sequestration. You're conserving it for that function. So layering another, you know, getting even more money out of the property for something you've already conserved it for, you know, that sort of stacking is really not the right thing to do. Not to say people haven't tried, but it all depends on what you're conserving the site for. There's been a lot of talk, you know, with grazing landscapes that perhaps carbon sequestration within the grassland is something that you could add onto a bank, because a lot of times we're not really conserving the grassland so much as we're conserving the other resources on the site that are associated with aquatic features. Anyway, that's an answer.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And I think we'll see, and we continue to discuss during our course, and it's and on previous webinars as well as our ones coming up, about those both creating a bank that's under joint authorities so that you can get maybe more bang for your buck and serve the purposes of many different organizations or regulatory authorities, also versus joint of this sort of stacking different types of resources. And there are kind of elements of that are kind of under investigation or piloting and things like that, water quality and carbon sequestration. So we continue to build those elements into our course, but and bring in conversations as we can. So we'll pick back up on that discussion potentially in part 1 and 2 of our alternatives conservation banking coming up. So I know we've got a couple other questions, but I'm going to save those till the end. So as we transition over to Clint, I'll get you situated to share your screen. Again, Clint is with the Conservation Fund. He's going to be talking through the role of the land trust as a third-party steward. What are the considerations they're taking on if they are going to be that conservation easement holder and supporting the stewardship of a bank into the long term. So with that, Clint, I'll turn things over to you to kick us off on this end of the presentation. And you are on mute, just to let you know. So there we go.
There, thank you. I lost my mute button when I made the switch over. Katie, thanks a million. I appreciate it. I remind folks that my name is Clint Miller, and I joined the Conservation Fund in 2008. I'm located in Rochester, Minnesota. I serve as the Central Midwest Regional Director, which is a new title, so I'm just getting used to that. I lead our project work here in the Upper Midwest, and I'm just wrapping up the Midwest Habitat Mitigation Project, which is actually a $22 million compensatory mitigation program for a 600-mile long oil pipeline running across 4 states in the Central Midwest. And I also help the conservation prepare for and submit our accreditation application, which will be relevant to some of the what I'll talk about. And I was part of the team at the Minnesota Land Trust many years ago. That was one of the first land trusts in the community or the country to apply when the accreditation program began. And I'm also commissioner now on the Land Trust Accreditation Commission. So with that, I want to thank Katie Allen and Margarita Carey for inviting me to participate and turning out to be the last speaker of the first part of the series. And also to Matt for being a terrific co-presenter on this part of the series. So Let me move on to talking about, or giving you a kind of an idea of what I'm going to talk about. And Matt and a lot of the other speakers before have talked about sort of that three-legged stool of mitigation, the financial assurances, the legal assurances, and then Matt just covered a lot of the management insurances. And in some ways, as I was thinking about this presentation this morning, I was thinking, you know, really, I'm talking about sort of the quality control over what you're doing and giving you some thoughts and ideas about selecting the right partners. Who are the right partners to work with, setting the right expectations, and knowing the questions to ask. And those will go a long way in developing a successful project. So as I was thinking through all that today, I started realizing really maybe that's sort of the theme of my presentation, and I'll touch on that in a number of different ways. And the way I think about this when I talk to people about mitigation, you can get your permit doing mitigation by creating a duck pond in the cloverleaf of an interstate. But is that really accomplishing conservation? Is that really advancing or giving ecological lift? Or is it better to do the hole in the donut project out on a 10,000 acre refuge where you're picking up and creating a management plan and stewarding a 40 acre tract that now allows 10,000 acres of land to be managed as one whole unit or in multiple phases? So that's really what I'm getting at with how you think about the projects that you do. And a lot of the other speakers have talked about project selection, location, the ins and outs, the legal pieces. I'm not going to touch on all that, so I'll touch a little differently. So I'm going to talk about roles and responsibilities of land trusts. I'm going to specifically, because nobody's really talked about what a land trust is, so I'll do a little bit of land trust 101. Talk a little bit more about fee owners, long-term fee owners, and the transition to long-term fee owners after the bank is closed. Talk more about easement holders, and I'll focus a little bit on that because that tends to be the mystery part of the land trust community, because land trusts are typically the holders. And then throughout the whole thing, I'll sprinkle in some tips and suggestions that hopefully will be useful for your long-term success on projects or approving projects too. I want to make sure I'm giving a nod to all the agency participants that are out there. So let me talk a little bit about the land trusts as partners and the land trust community. And just I've got a couple of links here. I think Margarita will put some of the other links in some of the materials that are provided as part of this seminar that you'll be able to pick up online. But the land trust community was born out of a need to supplement public conservation options. It's about 1,600 land trusts across the country, more or less. And there's a link here to the Land Trust Alliance, which is sort of our professional organization of land trust in the land trust community. And land trusts are typically driven by the standards and practices. They set industry standards. These standards and practices guide those best practices, and they guide behavior associated with the governance of an organization, the finances, the land protection, and the land stewardship. And typically a land trust will adopt and follow those land trust standards and practices. And those are developed and really approved by Land Trust Alliance, but they're developed by the land trust community. And one of the things I want to make sure to really emphasize is not all land trusts are the same. Land trusts typically have a geography, a watershed, or some sort of conservation target that they have in mind. It could be something that's very local. It could be something that's very broad, as big as a state. And they can work broadly in places like here in Minnesota, where the Minnesota Land Trust is a large statewide land trust, focuses on a variety of specific landscapes within the state, but really they're the only land trust that works at a large state or regional scale. There's very few other land trusts here in Minnesota. You hop across the border in Wisconsin and there's 54 land trusts. Those land trusts focus on areas as small as a watershed or as large as, say, the northwestern portion of the state, and they have very specific things. They may work on farmland conservation, or they may work on river or riparian area conservation. Land trusts typically work with easements, although not all land trusts do easements. Sometimes they do both. They do fee acquisition or fee land protection. They sometimes own land. They sometimes facilitate ownership of land or easements for other organizations or for local or state or federal government. There's a few land trusts out there that have restoration capacity where they can actually own, especially if they own or manage land, They may have top-notch land management or restoration programs, or they affiliate themselves with organizations that do. But that's pretty uncommon. It's certainly here in the central Midwest, it's not common to find land trusts who have a lot of stewardship capacity. And then the other thing that land trusts have is an advocacy role. A lot of these land trusts evolved from groups of citizens who advocated for the protection of a very specific place or a very specific piece of land. And then they organically grew into an organization with a broader mission, and they found a niche in the land trust community. So they may still see advocacy as a very important tool that they're willing to use to protect land or to steward land, perhaps against the same kind of infrastructure that is requiring mitigation. So keep that in mind, as particularly as the agencies, and mitigation providers are looking at, what do we do or who do we partner with? Does this culture fit with what we're after? Land trusts work at different scales. So as I said, they can be very small. They could be mom and pop operations with an all volunteer organizations, or they can be large multi-million-dollar operations with hundreds of staff. There are several very, very large land trusts in the country, some of whom work on just very small geographies or very narrow conservation niches. One of the things I want to mention too is about accreditation. Accreditation is obviously an important piece of the mitigation community. Certainly in places like California, land trusts are encouraged or required to, in some cases, work with accredited land trusts. And not all land trusts are accredited. In fact, there's only about 400, a little bit more than 450, 460 land trusts in the country that actually have achieved the accreditation seal. And Accreditation Commission was established as an industry response to potential additional government oversight more than a decade ago after some land trusts were accused of bad behavior. And what accreditation is a third-party verification of adherence to a subset of critical standards and practices that were developed by the land trust community. I remember what I mentioned earlier about the standards and practices. That was developed by the land trust community. The accreditation is taking a subset of those, the real critical ones, and making sure through a verification process that the land trusts are actually adhering to those. It makes a difference with the land trusts accredited. Basically, what the Accreditation Commission doing is giving a seal of approval that these land trusts have met very specific requirements, real critical requirements. And it's important for land trusts because oftentimes they're jumping ahead of the line. They're getting in front of the line for funding or for federal programs or even state programs where there's a requirement for an entity to work with an accredited land trust. Agencies are more inclined to let somebody else vet that land trust rather than vetting it on their own. In the old days, a agency who wanted to make sure they're working with a good partner would have to do all the verification or would do the verification themselves. Standards and practices don't, one of the things I want to mention though with accreditation is that accreditation and mitigation doesn't always line up. For example, the standards and practices requirements don't always line up exactly with the requirements that regulators might have. The specific example is the language in a conservation easement required by Accreditation Commission and required by the standards and practices is typically not included in template easements provided by regulators for mitigation projects. There's often a clause in there specific to proceeds that is not included. In order for a land trust to get accredited, they have to have that language within their easements, which is a fundamental problem right there, is that, oftentimes the land trust comes in for accreditation and the commission says, look, you're missing some key language that's required for good standards and practices in your easement. We need you to go back and make those changes. We need to make those changes going forward. So the agencies that are working on the mitigation banks and permitting mitigation banks and creating these templates need to be thoughtful about the kinds of language that is required in conservation and make sure they line up. One of the ones that's even a little bit more critical is the public support test. So the IRS has a rule around nonprofits like land trusts to demonstrate that they receive broad public support, broad support from various financial sources for their mission. Now, land trusts that only gets income from one source, like mitigation projects, unlikely to meet this test. And by extension, they're unlikely to qualify for accreditation. So oftentimes I hear mitigation providers or project proponents saying, well, let's just create a land trust. We'll have our own land trust. Or we'll create a land trust specific for this. that's difficult to do because of the requirements of public support. So it all depends on whether or not you can, whether you can accomplish that. I talk a little bit now about the long-term fee owner and the difference between, or the kinds of landowners that you might be working with as you establish a bank, or as you roll out of the bank, or even when you're not doing a banking project. Who are those partners that you might be working with? So private landowners have a few key concerns, and there's some good benefits to work with them. First of all, their capacity for management and potential for violating the easement terms may be wildly different. So risk for violating easement terms or disagreement with management goes up as you change private landowners. So private landowners may not always, the first owner you work with on a property may sell that land to another owner, and that the easement on the project will go with it, but the subsequent owners typically don't have the same respect for, or don't have the same view of the conservation as the original owners. So that adds an element of risk. The private landowners may have difficulty or not understand how they access the long-term stewardship funds that Matt mentioned. How do those landowners, or which ways do they access those funds? They need clarification of that, and on whose responsibilities it is to manage the property and the compensation for that work that gets performed. And it may be simple. It may be the same landowner you started with working at the bank. It may be the same landowner afterwards. And that's really, there's benefits, big benefits to that. One of the things I want to mention too, and this is the point that I wanted to bring it up, was the conservation easement holders. There is something that's a reference related to affirmative rights within conservation easements. So it's atypical for a conservation easement holder to retain the right to step in and take responsibility for actions should the fee owner not be complying with the easement. But mitigation easements often provide for that affirmative rights, or an expectation that the easement holder, the land trust typically, will take some action. So it's really critical for the easement holder, particularly land trust, to understand this and have that kind of financial and operational resources to take this responsibility on should it happen. And that's typically of a concern when you're working with private landowners, when you've got an easement holder as a land trust and the private landowner as the fee owner of the property. I'll talk a little bit here too about agency ownership. When I'm talking about agency, it could be state, local, or federal government ownership, either during the bank's active period or after the bank. And one of the points I want to make here is it's really good to be thoughtful about which agencies you work with and contact them early and often. And if you're looking at long-term, an agency taking over a piece of property that was a bank or is a bank, to really make sure that they've got the capacity and the resources to pull that off. So there may be additional requirements for that property conveyance. And one of the examples I'll give just popped up for me yesterday was a Department of Justice settlement that required the conveyance of 500 acres of land to a state agency. Everything was all set up, ready to go, but at the very last minute, there was a question about the payment in lieu of tax payment. So the PILT payment, what the agency would be providing to the county in lieu of the normal taxes. And in this particular state, it's a state statutory requirement that the state pays classification, pays the taxes at the classification at which time the land was conveyed to them. And in this case, the land is zoned classified as industrial, which is twice as much as agriculture. Doesn't seem like a lot of money when you're only talking a $4,000 difference, but that's a big amount of money for an agency that doesn't have a revenue source specific to cover those taxes over time. So here at 11th hour, they're scrambling to figure out, how do we deal with this? Can we get the county to change the classification? Because the state agency is refusing to take the property, even though it would fit in very, very well with their conservation objectives. So again, really important to understand early and upfront what the kind of unique rules that might come with working in agency. Agencies typically, like a lot of organizations, want to make sure that they have an active role prior to the transfer, so that they may be looking at unique things to do for input and preparation of the land. Matt talked a bit about, those other pieces that you need to anticipate fencing needs, or dealing with pumps or water systems, making sure that those things are in place so that there's funds available to deal with those. And one of the other unique pieces of government entities is it's hard to commit today to something that might happen in the future. So if you're developing a bank adjacent to a federal or state or local government protected area, and your intent is to convey that property to that entity, oftentimes the government agencies cannot commit to taking something or to obligating a future administration to accepting a piece of land. So be super thoughtful about whether or not you can actually pull that off. And as regulators, you need to understand that the banker, the mitigation provider may not be able to make that commitment or prove that commitment because of the agency's specific requirements. And then I'll talk briefly about nonprofit owners. Nonprofits can be a terrific opportunity to work with as a long-term owner. The one concern I will have, and so a lot of folks assume that the land trust that's holding the conservation easement can probably take over either management long-term or even ownership of the property. You need to be very careful of that, because conservation easements, if they're holding the conservation easement and they get the fee, those interests merge. And so you got to find somewhere that there can be another conservation easement holder. And not all land trusts, as I pointed out earlier, have land management capacity. So it might not be the right strategy or the right organization to work with. All right, let me move on to talking about conservation easement holders. And I'm going to specifically focus or really focus more on typically the holders that are typically a land trust. And my tips here are mostly to sort of the mitigation providers, but also the regulators that are on the phone, and thinking about, instead of just saying, hey, let's go out and find a land trust, let's think about some of these things that land trusts may be concerned about or that you can help with as you approach a land trust as a potential partner. The number one thing I'll say is get to know your land trust community. Land trusts in nearly every state usually have annual meetings. They usually have a coalition that they work with each other on. It's really good to get to know who those people are and what their capacities are, what their conservation objectives are. That's a really valuable tool for both the agency folks as well as for the mitigation providers. So first thing is cultural fit. As I mentioned early, some of these groups came in from started as advocacy organizations. They may not fit with they may not be interested in doing mitigation on projects where they were previously or currently opposing. Transparency associated with, what is it that you're looking for? What role are they going to play is really important. I think it's also important to, in a lot of times with agencies, to understand that just because the Fish and Wildlife Service recommends a specific, or an agency recommends a specific land trust, that land trust may have absolutely no relationship with the resource agency and may not understand why they're being picked out as somebody to work with. There's a lot of educational opportunities for working with land trusts, particularly from the agencies, for them to talk about their role in mitigation and the opportunities that mitigation presents for them for accomplishing their conservation objectives. It's also an opportunity to find out more about the strength and capacity of the land trusts that you work with. And one of the things I'll point out here too is, outside of California, California has a tremendously strong land trust community as well as mitigation community with a lot of experience with mitigation. You get outside of California and it can be a much different story. There's a lot of opportunity for education of both the agencies as well as both the land trust community, but as well as the regulatory and mitigation provider community. Matt mentioned this earlier with the language differences. Endowments is not a term that, for example, that is common within the land trust community. We talk about restricted funds, donor restricted versus board restricted funds. There are investment procedures for all those, especially for accredited or land trusts who have accepted or adopted the standards and practices. There's oftentimes, we talk about easement stewardship and enforcement funds. Land trusts know how to calculate those, but as Matt mentioned, the land management funds, how do what's the money available for managing, whether the land trust plays a role in that or potential role. Land trusts typically don't have that experience doing that, and I think the Nature Conservancy and the Center for Natural Lands Management examples that Matt provided are terrific tools for figuring that out. The other thing I will mention too is about on the easement holders, just looking at capacity. So if you're looking at these land trusts or these easement holders, try to figure out what their staffing is like. Do they have the internal land management or project management staff to deal with anything more than just enforcing or managing a conservation easement? And if that conservation easement requires exercise of affirmative rights or the right to go in and do something that the landowner's not doing, you need to know if they've got the capacity to be able to do that, or if there's a mechanism, a partnership that they may have to make that happen. One of the key ones I think that you'll find, and it's a quick question, not a lot of land trusts have this, is do they have internal legal counsel? And does that internal legal counsel have experience dealing with mitigation agreements or mitigation providers? Not a lot of land trusts retain internal legal counsel because it is expensive. And so oftentimes, they may be going to outside sources to do that. And then the other big question is how much fee management of land or easement management experience does a land trust have, or does your partner, your easement holder have? Because remember, the easement is really part of that long-term protection of this project. And the better you understand the capacity of that organization that you're working with, the more likely your project is going to be successful. And I'm going to mention at this point too, co-holding a conservation easement and what that is. So it's just it's a little piece that I didn't quite know where to fit in, but co-holding a conservation easement was where a land trust or multiple land trusts can co-hold that conservation easement either with each other or with an agency. Now that in the mitigation world, I've seen some of these, but not often. But what it does do is within the easement allows a couple of entities to bring the different strengths that they might have to a co-holding or to a co-monitoring situation. It also, typically, all this is spelled out within the easement document, and it also spells out with who is going to take on what responsibilities. Let me talk briefly too about reputational risk, and I'm going to actually bump that and mention that a little bit later because I think it's important to talk about reputational risk for the land trust community and for who you're working with. But I'll talk a little bit here about financial assurances. And financial stability is really important when you're working with the land trust or with your easement holder, because they are supposed to be there in perpetuity. So you want to know, or you want to be sure that they've got the right kinds of policies and procedures set up to be there. So you're going to be looking at things like their 990 form, which is a tax form that all nonprofits file. You'll be probably interested in their annual audits or their financials and determining, are they retaining or bringing in the right amount of income? Do they have revenue diversity? And I mentioned earlier the public support test. Again, accredited land trusts, somebody else is looking out for you. But if you're dealing with a land trust that is not accredited, you're probably going to have to do some of this homework yourself or try to understand that. And the other piece of this, and I'll talk about the financial assurances, and Matt brought some of these up, and I think other speakers have as well, is you really need to be expecting to pay for the administrative overhead that a land trust is going to put into these projects. Even if these projects line up very tightly with their conservation objectives, you'll want to be, you'll be thinking ahead that you're going to want to cover some of that. And then easement stewardship. So as we mentioned that earlier, that's different than the land stewardship. This is just managing and monitoring and enforcing that conservation easement. Land trusts have that down. They can tell you what those costs are going to be, although they will also have to remember that, there may be with a mitigation project more work that needs to be done. So they'll adjust, they'll typically adjust things. And then also, there are other things, land management things that they need to add to that. I've mentioned standards and practices and accreditation. The accreditation process helps that land trust skip ahead in the line and maybe a way of getting your project approved a little bit sooner because you're working with accredited land trust. But one of the things that I think is really important to do, and we saw this happen in the state of Missouri. The state of Missouri was really interested in having land trusts moving the land trust accreditation process along within their state. The land trusts in the state, there were about a dozen land trusts certainly interested in becoming accredited, but they were struggling to be able to do that. It's not an inexpensive process. So there's a lot of time associated with that. So they got support from the state to really help with education and moving towards accreditation. So as mitigation providers, as regulators, think about ways that you can advance that accreditation process for these land trusts. Are there ways of providing folks that can come in and help the land trust get their accreditation done? Are there opportunities for advocacy for accreditation? Can the Land Trust Alliance and land trust efforts to support them in doing some of that work? The other thing I will mention too is certainly with mitigation providers and with the agency folks is support the Land Trust Alliance and these land trusts in their efforts to eliminate bad actors and fraudulent behavior, particularly within that land trust community. There are efforts that need support, like getting rid of syndicated conservation easements, which is bilking taxpayers for billions of dollars. And the other piece that I will point out here, too, it's a bit of an aside, is be a partner in advocating for strong easement statutes, which are perennially under attack in many states. There are continual attacks on the easement statutes, which govern the ability of a land trust and the capacity of a land trust to enforce conservation easements, and they're constantly being attacked in attempts to erode those in a lot of states throughout the U.S., usually on an annual basis. All right, so I'm going to finish up here with a little bit thinking about if I'm a land trust, what am I looking for when I'm a land trust at these at mitigation opportunities? And really what a land trust is looking for, and this is, I think, the important thing to keep in mind as regulators, as mitigation providers, is land trusts are looking for a way to advance their conservation objectives. So if you're keeping in mind that they are looking for how does this project that you're hoping to bring them in on fit with their long-term conservation objectives of watershed protection, of farmland protection, if you can make those two pieces work, if those two pieces can come together, you're going to have a good, successful project. So it's that fit with the mission and fit with those conservation goals. It's also a cultural fit, as I mentioned earlier. Partnership for nonprofits is not partnership of land trusts with for-profit companies is not the norm. And I also mentioned too that oftentimes the people that the land trust community knows within the agencies, the DNRs, the federal government, are not always the same people that are dealing with the regulatory side. They may know more of the management side, folks. So there's an opportunity to get to know the land trust community that would be very helpful. And then the second thing, or one of the other things, is the long-term obligations, expectations associated with the risk. Really be upfront and transparent about what is that risk, what are the opportunities that, what are the risks that transfer over to the land trust? What are they going to have to deal with down the road? Who is expected to do what? Is really critical. And what happens when an easement has to be enforced? What support are they going to get after the bank is closed? And how are those costs going to be covered? You've got easement stewardship, you've got fee management potentially, you've got administrative and overhead. And it's also one of the things, and I think Matt was getting there too, or one of the Katie's questions referenced it, is sort of thinking about a contingency fund. How do we deal with things such as climate change? It's hard to calculate some of those things right now today, but maybe that there's an opportunity for dealing with a contingency fund. Thinking about that is how do we wrap that into our budget? Transparency is absolutely critical. It's really crucial. Meet with your potential partner early and often. So for a land trust, they want to know more. They're eager to know more about the mitigation as an opportunity to advance their conservation objectives. And they want to be thoughtful. One of the things I'll mention is a reputational issue for land trusts. Terrific land trust down in central Illinois has been partnering with the wind energy community, and they've done a couple of projects with the wind community doing some mitigation. They were very thoughtful about how they approach things. They were advancing their conservation objectives. One of the blowback pieces that they received, which was completely unexpected, was the anti-wind movement started to blame the land trust for accelerating the movement of wind into wind towers into the community, because there was a huge anti-wind movement, particularly amongst the agricultural producers who did not want to see wind turbines in the area, and so they felt the brunt of that backlash, and that's still ongoing for them. So it was a little bit of an unexpected sector. So they're thinking about reputational risks, and then clearly liability and other things as well. The relationship that a landowner has with the land trust is really pretty critical. Land trusts focus on that as their way of mitigating potential problems down the road, is to have good relationships. So it's really key as a banker and as regulator to meet up front with those land trusts or those easement holders or those long-term managers of the land and work out the things that they need to work out. So with that, I'm going to wrap up and just remind you of those legal assurances, financial assurances, management assurances, all wrapped up in sort of this quality assurance. It's that duck pond in the the clover leaf of the interstate, or is that hole in the donut on the 10,000 acre refuge that you're aiming for, and what's the quality that you're going to get? That's it, Katie. Hopefully I've kept us on time and happy to answer questions.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Clint. That was outstanding. And with you and Matt, a great conversation started here. A lot of detailed perspective provided. So I want to thank both of you. I've got a couple questions, Clint, maybe to pick up on where you left off. And you mentioned a bit about, and what you provided was a checklist of things that prevents this from happening. Financial assurances, legal insurances, the whole gamut of experience that these land trusts have. Coming from states where maybe those accredited land trusts are few, there might be a strong mitigation banking community. We have, and a question alluded to, that some mitigation providers are setting up their own land trusts to kind of fulfill their own stewardship needs, but yet there might be some thoughtful questions that should be asked about that. And I wanted to highlight that we do have an article that we have provided with the materials of this course on the website about the demise of the environmental trust, which highlights a play-by-play of a land trust with mitigation obligations going bankrupt and causing, additional ripples and issues with that. So, aside of maybe mitigation providers setting up their own land trusts, that creates a risky situation. But could you go a little bit further to talk about what might happen if a land trust was to close with those types of mitigation easements in hand? Where would the obligation go to?
So great question, Katie, and I will do my best to answer it. And the first thing I will say is it really depends on the easement. So if they're the easement holder, so I'm making the assumption that they're the easement holder and land trust is part of an overall mitigation plan. First of all states are different. So there are enabling statutes for conservation easements in all different states, Puerto Rico and elsewhere, and the Virgin Islands, that sort of govern the structure and the enforcement of conservation easements and address some of those problems. Commonly, the general easements, any easements or orphan easements would oftentimes be enforced by the state's attorneys general. That's sort of the default in these enabling statutes. However, most of the time you will see land trust merging or somebody else taking on the responsibility of those conservation easements. Again, when you're dealing with places where there are gaps in service, it may be, as I pointed out earlier, the opportunity or the potential for co-holding. and looking at, can you have sort of double up? Maybe there's an opportunity to co-hold with a stronger land trust, but the land trust itself that you're really interested in is in the right geography and the right position to be able to do what you need to be delivered. So orphan easements are a struggle. They will get placed. The question is just how they will get placed and where they get placed.
Interesting. Great. And Matt, not to kind of put the mitigation providers under any sort of bus situation, but wanted to ask you from kind of maybe the association perspective of seeing that trend. I don't think maybe it's not a strong trend at all, but some providers supporting their own goals with a land trust coming up. Have you seen sort of best practices or does that put create a risky situation from your perspective or the association? Has that been something that's been talked about?
There's of course some potential risks, but I think it's a practice that's been happening in California probably for 15 years. I think it can be managed. It can actually work, but I think it's who makes up the board of the land trust or the nonprofit, and of course who their staff are. And so I think it can be doable. There just has to be enough separation between the party needing mitigation and the nonprofit who's holding the easement. And I've seen it work pretty well in a number of situations here in the Sacramento area.
Excellent.
Yeah, I mean, and I'll build on that too, Katie, is I don't disagree with Matt. I mean, I think there are opportunities to make things work where you do have these gaps, but we need to really. We've discussed it certainly here in the Midwest where we have very few accredited land trusts. We have an enormous geography. We don't even have land trusts that cover most of that geography. And there are mitigation opportunities that exist that I think some of the mitigation providers and the project developers are missing out. They're just missing out on. Could you work with a national organization? Yes, there are some national organizations who are willing to take these things on. But really the question is, and I see one of the questions that came up here in the chat to me was about, can as a city, as a fee owner, grant an easement to its own lighting and open space maintenance district? Well, sure you can, but I mean, think about it. It's a little self-serving to have, are they going to really enforce that conservation easement? Are they really going to have the capacity to step in? Back to Matt's point about the separation, the legal separation, the staff separation, the governance separation, the financial separation, all of those pieces are really key when it comes to long-term protection. May get you through during the active period of the bank, but it's really after that bank, do you have the right setup to be able to force it? And again, accreditation is sort of the jump ahead part. You would assume an accredited land trust has the right governance, financial structure, transactional capacity and stewardship capacity to manage these long-term easement obligations as well as potentially some of the fee. But have to be thoughtful about making sure you have clear separation.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I just got a question kind of going back to the co-holder scenario, Clint, if it was with a state agency. Any thoughts on condemnation issues with land trust, and does that co-holder role provide more protection, or some thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a terrific question. I will do my best, and I'm certainly not an attorney, and I'm not going to try to over-represent my knowledge on this, but my experience has been co-holding with a state or federal or even municipal government oftentimes gives you a backup. It gives you more oomph when you have to push back on something. An example I'll give, and I can't even believe I'm remembering this, is probably from 20 years ago, where the city here in Minnesota wanted to push a water line along a trout stream on a piece of property that had just been protected by a conservation easement. As an easement that I actually worked with the landowner to buy using federal scenic byway money. So the federal government had a third-party interest in this particular. They weren't necessarily a co-holder, but they had a third-party interest in the easement. And there was very specific language that in the easement that talked about the responsibilities and the implications of having that. Just the threat of having the federal government involved in blocking this water line that was supposed to go down this trout stream and the potential negative impacts was enough to make that condemnation threat go away. So does it work all the time? Not necessarily. And, you know, our infrastructure development across easement lands appropriate sometimes, sure. But again, that's back to that proceeds clause that is oftentimes not included in mitigation easements because you need to be able to deal with those. So yes, co-holding with a government entity adds a level of help or protection maybe, but it doesn't prevent everything.
I think that was a very legally great explanation of it. You know, keep it
swimming through the crowd.
Yeah. Yeah. Matt, if you've got perspective on that question, feel free to jump in if you've got your own example either.
No, I think Clint's answer to that was perfect. Yeah, you have to very carefully navigate that one. Good job.
And I wanted to go back to the topic that we had kind of before in between presentations on climate change, and just wanted to get kind of a read on maybe the land trust community in general. Are you seeing climate change or climate impact language in easement language coming up? You know, essentially these are set up to preserve essential, you know, environmental or conservation values. If that changes as a result of climate change, is that something that we're navigating now as a land trust community?
So I'm going to show my cards a little bit here on the climate change or the concerns about how valuable easements are in dealing with changes on the land. So conservation easements are really best suited for the big things in life, preventing the subdivision, the legal subdivision or parceling of a piece of land, preventing infrastructure development like roads or houses or other big things from coming on the property. But they're not particularly suited for dealing with ecological changes on the land. So changes in forest condition, changes in lands, you know, water conditions. That's tough to do in an easement. It's tough to prescribe how things should be, or even to guess how things should be. So the land trust community is, I would say, taking a reasonably healthy approach to really focusing their easement protection efforts on those big things, and then working, you know, in some ways as, for example, requiring a management plan for an easement property, but that management plan is outside of the actual recorded document. It's something that can evolve over time, and as Matt said earlier, it's allowable to be adaptive. And I think, you know, being careful to separate, again, I'm giving you my opinion, is to separate out the really big things in life with the easement, and then require those things that need to evolve over time as components of that easement, but not as in the recorded document. So that, I think, is how they're tackling it. Now, the Land Trust Alliance is making a really big push to address climate change. That is one of and the Land Trust community last 5 years has been really looking at, as you talked earlier about, you know, are there opportunities to take advantage of carbon sequestration, selling of carbon credits on certain lands. There's a lot of exploration going on now about how can we stack or can we add to the protection of a piece of property by doing some of these additional components. I'd say the jury's still out on some of that because it's complicated. Once you've done an easement on a piece of property that has specific restrictions, can you add to that? What do you add that really benefits climate? So, I don't know, Matt, I'd be delighted to hear your thoughts too.
Yeah, it's what you're alluding to is, like I said, it's like we only have so many levers and knobs we can actuate on a property, on a preserve, and a lot of times when it comes to climate change and climate weirdness, it's a regional issue. And, it goes way beyond the site, and it's really, working with all the other interests in the area to try to find a solution. So, and to Clint's point, the management plan can really tie your hands on a lot of things you think you could do to, accommodate some of the stressors, but you have to approach it very carefully, because I think our first thing we need to remember is land managers is to try to do no harm, when we're managing the land first. Because I've certainly seen the harm component come in when people have the best intentions, but they kind of push the pendulum a little bit too far one direction, and it swings back and hits them in the forehead. So.
And I think the example I'll give is that some of the things that I've seen in the evolution of conservation easements. Easements have been around for 50 years, so they're not entirely new. Land trusts haven't been really around that much longer. They in the IRS rules around easements really haven't been around that long, and that's really where the rules came from, was the IRS opportunity to deduct conservation easements that were donated. So, now, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of states have their own enabling statutes. All states do right now. But it's these old easements that just you crack up when you read them. They say, you cannot use certain color siding on your house, or you can't use certain chemicals on the property. You can't hunt during this period of time. Those are difficult things that for an easement holder to manage and monitor. And if you're not managing and monitoring the actual terms of the easement, are you doing the right job stewarding that easement? And when you do have a violation of the easement, your argument's a little weaker if you haven't been enforcing these other pieces. So again, back to thinking about easements as the big things in life, creating that opportunity, that niche in an easement to deal with these changing conditions on the land, or things that are more well suited to do from a management standpoint, maybe a better way to go, but not always. So.
No, I appreciate that, and I think emphasizing Matt's comment that it's obviously this type of climate change or whatever impact might be to a site is not just isolated to that site, and I think emphasizing that bringing mitigation providers, regulators, public land managers, private land managers, communities into these conversations it's a regional scope that's needed to address anything that's going to be impacting at that finer grain. And it would be one thing for Matt and his bank to stipulate what he can do for adaptive management, but it would also have to sync up with everybody in the geography to also be swimming in the same direction to support any types of climate change remediation or sustainability, resiliency, all of those things. So still looking for questions. We've got about 10 minutes if anybody has any additional questions. I think we've touched on pretty much most of the things that I've gotten in. Clint or Matt, have you guys questions for each other, or any other topics you want to weave into in our remaining time here?
I guess one thing I'd like to mention, if for practitioners or bankers or mitigation providers or anyone who's going to be on the receiving end of an endowment or a stewardship fund, that they understand the mechanics of how those funds flow, when they flow, and how they're accounted for, because it varies depending on who holds that stewardship fund. And depending on your fund holder, you may find that you only get money in December. So depending on how your accounting works within your own organization, that may be problematic. So go in eyes wide open when you start establishing stewardship funds.
Yeah, that's a good point. And we did get a question kind of going a little bit deeper into your fence example, and to say, you said that you're not always planning for the fence to be replaced fully, but in the accounting, you would potentially pay out what portion you need for that year, but you have sort of I think you say in other presentations, like a tenth of the payment of the full fence replacement up to year 10 will be paid into that fund. Can you kind of go through that a little bit more about how that functions and payout?
Yeah, I mean, so the fencing example is something. Fencing is expensive, and when you have a large property, it gets really costly really fast. And out in the West, you can get 50 years out of a fence, 30 to 50 years. But in practice, you very rarely replace your entire fence all at once at a 50-year interval. So sometimes in our endowments, we'll break them down so you replace like 1/4 of the fence every 15 years. So that you're getting sort of a flow over time to help you keep the fence in one piece. That's one of the ways we tackle it. There's a lot of different ways to accomplish these sort of really long-term big expenses. But in my experience, I have yet to find the perfect solution for that, because chances are something happens, the fire comes, your fence is gone, you have to do it this year, period. But yeah, oftentimes we'll break up those really large expenses into 10 or 15-year chunks if we can. I don't know if that answers the question or not. But.
I think so. It makes sense. Thank you. And yeah, we're just about out of time. I have one kind of, I think, great summary question for Clint. We talked a little bit of gaps in service and those types of things. And I wondered if you had any recommendations for regulators to help build capacity in a region that might not be served through a land trust. Kind of seeing definitely those regulators hoping that an accredited land trust comes across with that proposal, so that they have minimize some of maybe what they feel might be risk taken care of. Do you see any likely partnerships that have formed, or that kind of education that's happening, or kind of good takeaways that we can pass along to those regulators joining today?
Yeah, I mean, as I alluded to the example, actually it was the Missouri Department of Conservation that wanted to start this is a little bit different, but it's similar. They were interested in starting a grant program specifically to increase the capacity of the land trust community to do projects that complemented their existing suite of land ownership, because they were thinking and realizing they were missing out on potential projects that were adjacent to conservation areas that provided public benefits. So they wanted to start a grant program, but their biggest concern was, did the land trust have the capacity to handle that? And so in parallel with setting up the grant program, they also developed, they actually funded the outreach to the Land Trust Alliance to bring in some educational opportunities and consultants to come in and help land trusts within the state of Missouri get accreditation done. And so they actually increased the capacity of the land trust by providing essentially staffing support or consultant support to make that happen. So that's one piece of it. I think that's probably an example where maybe a little too much of a stretch for some of the regulators. But certainly having those regulators get to know the capacity of the land trust community and who those people are, and attending a lot of these land trusts have these annual meetings or annual gatherings, being a presenter and talking about getting to know those folks and getting to know where the gaps might be, and then having a discussion about how you might fill those gaps, I think is one productive way to do that. And then also getting an idea of again, who the national players are that might be able to come out and participate, and understanding a little bit more about standards and practices and accreditation and how important that is, so that that you're not hooking up or recommending bad actors, because there are bad actors when you've got billions of dollars of federal tax benefits available to people who donate conservation easements, in particular, donate land. There's going to be bad actors both on the land trust side, the appraisal side, and the landowner side. So I mentioned syndicated conservation easements. That's one in particular that the land trust community has been fighting for years. So,
fantastic.
Just some thoughts.
Absolutely. I think some great takeaways there. And hopefully that serves sparks some ideas, some inspiration of how to network between the regulators, the land trust community, the private bankers in an area. to start to fill those gaps. And absolutely, I think it does start understanding kind of those processes, the capacity, what can folks do and when to be a part of establishing more banks or in lieu fee programs in any given state in their their able role to do so. With that, though, I want to close us out today. I appreciate so much. Thank you to Matt Goss from Westervelt Ecological Services and from Clint Miller from the Conservation Fund. Fantastic presentation from both of you on long-term management and stewardship.